What if I told you that Captain Ibrahim Traoré just invited the most feared man on earth to Burkina Faso? No, this isn't a rumor. It's real. While the West trembles and threatens war, one African nation is standing its ground. In Ouagadougou, history is being rewritten, and the world is not ready. A handshake that could shift the global balance, and an alliance that might cost lives. This is not just politics. It's revolution. And it's unfolding right now. So if you care about truth, power, and Africa's fight for freedom, hit like, subscribe, and stay till the end. You won't believe what happens next. If you believe that a small nation can still stand tall against global giants, if you believe that Africa deserves to write its own story, in its own voice, if you see the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes, then this story is yours too. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Not just to support, but to stand with us. Together, we ride the wave of a quiet awakening. Because what once were whispers, have now become a storm. And that's exactly where this story begins. While most leaders played it safe, Captain Ibrahim Traoré chose fire. In a world where small nations are expected to bow, he stood up, and made a move no one saw coming. He didn't just criticize the West. He dared to defy it. Publicly. Boldly. He sent a personal invitation to K.im J.on.g U.n, the man many consider the world's most dangerous leader. Not to negotiate. Not to mediate. To visit. To stand on African soil, not as a threat, but as a symbol. The world was stunned. Governments scrambled. Intelligence agencies were caught off guard. Media outlets exploded with headlines. Burkina Faso aligns with North Korea. Traoré risks war. But behind all the outrage, there was something else. Fear. Because Captain Ibrahim Traoré had crossed a line that Africa was never meant to cross. He didn't ask permission. He didn't explain. He acted. And that terrified them. Why would a small, landlocked country challenge global powers like this? Why would an African president risk everything for one visit? The answer wasn't political, it was personal. For Traoré, it was about dignity. About legacy. About standing up for every African nation told to wait their turn. And as the invitation reached Pyongyang, something unbelievable happened. K.im J.on.g U.n said yes. Within hours, a reply was sent. The visit was confirmed. For the first time in history, North Korea's leader would step foot in Africa, by invitation of a young revolutionary with nothing to lose and everything to fight for. From that moment on, the world wasn't watching out of curiosity. It was watching out of fear. Because Captain Ibrahim Traoré had just lit a match beneath the global order. And the flame was spreading fast. But with one invitation, everything began to unravel. The West didn't wait long. Within days of the announcement, phone lines lit up across embassies. Messages came flooding in. Stern warnings, veiled threats. The United States issued a formal statement condemning the visit. France followed, calling it a dangerous provocation. Behind closed doors, Western diplomats labeled it a betrayal. An act of war, even. And yet, Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't flinch. He read every message. Listened to every warning. Then he looked up, calm as ever, and said, "Let them come." His cabinet sat in stunned silence. But he was already moving forward. Because for him, this wasn't a misstep, it was the plan. Soon, the threats intensified. Economic sanctions were drafted. Trade agreements put on hold. Military analysts in Europe whispered about preemptive countermeasures. Intelligence agencies warned of isolation, even regime change. One report suggested the West might back a coup to stabilize Burkina Faso. Still, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stayed the course. To his allies, he explained it simply. Africa cannot claim its freedom if it panics every time the colonizers raise their voices. His words carried more than defiance, they carried history. Sankara's dream. Lumumba's sacrifice. Nkrumah's fire. Now it was Traoré's turn to take the hit, and not fall. But the pressure was relentless. Foreign banks froze transactions linked to Burkina Faso. Western media ran stories portraying Traoré as a reckless strongman. One outlet called him the African K.im J.on.g U.n. But they didn't see what his people saw, a man who wouldn't kneel. And in Ouagadougou, something remarkable began to stir. Crowds gathered in the capital. Not in fear, but in pride. They chanted his name. They painted murals of him standing beside Sankara. They lit candles outside government buildings. And above all, they said the words the West never expected to hear again. We are not afraid. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had taken a match to the illusion of control. And now, the people of Burkina Faso were fanning the flame. Together. The visit hadn't even begun, but the revolution already had. And then, it actually happened. In the early hours of a humid morning, K.im J.on.g U.n's plane pierced the skies over Ouagadougou. Security forces snapped to attention. The streets were empty but charged, like a live wire before a storm. Across the capital, television screens lit up. Eyes watched. Hearts raced. The world had held its breath. And now, the unthinkable was unfolding. The plane touched down without a hitch. A motorcade rolled out. And there, on the tarmac, stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, calm, steady, unshaken. As K.im J.on.g U.n stepped onto Burkinabe soil, the two men locked eyes. Then came the handshake. Cameras clicked. History snapped into focus. That single gesture sent shockwaves across the globe. News anchors in New York gasped live on air. Emergency meetings were held in Brussels and Washington. The visit was no longer theoretical. It was real. And that terrified the powers who had built their dominance on silence and submission. But in Burkina Faso, it was celebration. People lined the streets, waving flags. Children climbed lampposts just to catch a glimpse of the convoy. Songs of liberation filled the air. The atmosphere was electric. But it was also fragile. Beneath the cheers lurked danger. Intelligence reports had already warned Traoré's team, an attack was possible. Perhaps even likely. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré refused to cancel. If we retreat at the first threat, he said, then we were never free to begin with. That afternoon, the unthinkable nearly happened. As the convoy made its way through a busy district, a loud bang echoed through the air. Then another. Gunfire. Panic erupted. People screamed. Security vehicles screeched to a halt. K.im.'s armored car took a sharp turn and vanished into a side street. Soldiers leapt out, weapons raised. The crowd scattered. It was chaos. A group of masked gunmen had targeted the convoy. They weren't amateurs. Trained. Coordinated. Armed with Western-made rifles. A message, loud and clear, this visit was not welcome. But they hadn't counted on Traoré. While others ducked for cover, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood his ground. He ordered his team to protect civilians first. Then he personally moved to K.im.'s location. No hesitation. No panic. Just resolve. By the time they reached safety, 3 attackers were down. The rest vanished into the city's shadows. And yet, the message failed. Because just hours later, Traore and K.im stood side by side, outside the presidential palace. Bruised but unbroken. Defiant. Alive. Cameras rolled. And Captain Ibrahim Traoré looked straight into the lens. "This is what freedom costs," he said. That evening, the world watched footage of a leader who wouldn't back down. And a country refusing to be silenced. The West had tried to stop a meeting. What they triggered instead was a movement. And the fire they meant to extinguish? It was now burning brighter than ever. And yet, despite every warning, the moment arrived. The world had tried to stop it, through threats, isolation, even whispers of sabotage. But none of it worked. As the sun rose over Ouagadougou, all eyes turned skyward. The North Korean plane, sleek, gray, and heavily guarded, cut through the clouds and descended towards Burkinabe soil. The city fell silent. Then, as the wheels touched the runway, history was made. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood tall at the military airstrip, flanked by elite guards. His face was calm, but his eyes were burning. When K.im J.on.g U.n stepped off the aircraft, there were no grand speeches. Just a handshake. Firm. Unapologetic. Defiant. That image was enough. Across the globe, news outlets scrambled. "Dictator meets revolutionary," one headline read. "Africa crosses the line," said another. Intelligence briefings were rushed to Western leaders. Sanctions were fast-tracked. Some even called it an act of aggression. But Traoré didn't flinch. Because for him, this wasn't provocation, it was liberation. The motorcade rolled through the capital. Crowds spilled into the streets, waving flags, cheering, some crying. For many, it wasn't about K.im. It was about what the visit symbolized: Africa rising. Taking control. Standing shoulder to shoulder with the world's most defiant regime, not in submission, but in self-determination. But then, everything changed. As the convoy neared the National Museum, a sudden explosion rocked the street. Panic. Screams. Smoke. Within seconds, gunfire erupted. It wasn't random. It was a planned, coordinated ambush. Aimed directly at the diplomatic convoy. People scattered. Soldiers took position. Bodyguards shielded the cars. K.im's vehicle reversed hard, vanishing behind an armored blockade. But in the chaos, one figure remained visible. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He didn't duck. He didn't run. Instead, he shouted orders, directing his men to protect civilians first. His voice cut through the chaos. Calm. Measured. The man at the center of the storm refused to retreat. Minutes felt like hours. Eventually, the assailants were repelled. Some fled. 2 were captured. And what they revealed sent chills through Traoré's cabinet: the attackers were not local. They were foreign-trained mercenaries, sent with one mission. End the visit. By any means. But it had failed. Later that evening, against every piece of advice, Traoré and K.im appeared together at a press briefing. Still in the same suits. Still standing side by side. No bulletproof glass. No fear. Just resolve. And then, Captain Ibrahim Traoré spoke. They thought this would scare us. They were wrong. Burkina Faso will not kneel. Not today. Not ever. The room erupted. Online, the video spread like wildfire. Across Africa, something stirred. Not anger, but courage. Because one man had dared to stare into the fire. and walk through it. And his name was Captain Ibrahim Traoré. But it wasn't over. The attack should have broken them. The convoy could have turned back. The visit could have ended there, quietly, with excuses, with shame. That's what the world expected. What the West wanted. A retreat. A silent collapse. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré had other plans. The morning after the ambush, Burkina Faso didn't wake up in fear. It woke up in defiance. Murals of Traoré appeared overnight, painted by youth, sprayed on walls with bold colors. Graffiti read, "This is our land." The streets buzzed not with dread, but with something far more dangerous to imperial control, pride. And then came the moment that changed everything. Against every threat, against every piece of advice from his own Security Council, Captain Ibrahim Traoré and K.im J.on.g U.n stood before thousands in Independence Square. No bulletproof shields. No masks. Just two men, standing under the sun, surrounded by their people. It wasn't just a speech. It was a message. To Africa. To the world. "We have been told to obey," Traoré began, voice steady. "To wait our turn. To stay silent while others write our history. But that ends today. Because if Burkina Faso stands, Africa stands. And we will never bow again." The crowd roared. What followed wasn't politics. It was a movement. Delegations from Mali, Niger, and the DRC sent statements of solidarity. Activists in Ghana, Senegal, and Ethiopia took to the streets. Videos flooded online, young Africans raising flags, quoting Traoré's words. Some called it the second wave of decolonization. Others simply called it the fire. But not everyone was celebrating. In Western capitals, panic spread. Intelligence reports warned of the chain reaction. Analysts spoke of a shift in global alliances. Behind closed doors, officials debated cyber attacks, economic retaliation, even blacklisting the country entirely. Still, Traoré didn't waver. "We do not seek war," he said during a night broadcast. "But we will no longer play by their rules. Africa is not their chessboard. We are players now. And we choose our own moves." And that was the point. The true power of Captain Ibrahim Traoré was never just the handshake, or the speech, or even the resistance. It was what he unlocked. A spirit long buried beneath foreign aid and false democracy. A belief that Africa could rise, not with permission, but with purpose. Yes, the threats grew louder. Sanctions followed. Embassies pulled staff. Western media painted Traoré as a reckless radical. But none of it mattered now. Because the people were awake. And they were no longer looking to the West for validation. They were looking to Captain Ibrahim Traoré. And they were ready to follow. The visit came to an end. But the story did not. As K.im J.on.g U.n boarded his plane and the engines roared back to life, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood at the edge of the runway, hand raised. Not in farewell, but in defiance. The world had thrown everything it could at him, pressure, isolation, threats, even bullets. But he was still standing. And so was Burkina Faso. Back in the capital, the people returned to their daily lives, but something had shifted. It was subtle at first. A change in posture. In tone. In how people spoke about their country, their future, their place in the world. No longer did they speak of surviving. They spoke of building. Leading. Becoming. Across Africa, his name echoed far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. Students in universities discussed his strategy. Farmers in rural villages whispered his courage. Soldiers in other nations began to question orders that served foreign masters more than their own people. Something real had been born. And the West? It watched in silence. Sanctions were imposed. Aid was suspended. But the world no longer held the same grip. Because the currency of fear was losing value. And in its place, courage was rising. But Traore knew the hardest days were still ahead. There would be more attacks. More lies. More attempts to isolate and destabilize. That's how empire always strikes back, through slow erosion, not loud explosions. But this time, the foundations were different. This time, the revolution had roots in the people. He met with his advisors the night after the departure. They spoke of food security, energy independence, Pan-African cooperation. No more begging. No more borrowed dreams. Only strategy. Only sovereignty. Before the meeting ended, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood up and looked at the group. They thought this would end with a plane taking off, he said quietly. But it was never about the visit. It was about the flame. And the flame is alive now, in every street, every home, every heart that refuses to be ruled. That silence in the room wasn't fear. It was understanding. Across the continent, more leaders began to speak differently. Some with caution. Others with fire. But all with one eye turned towards Ouagadougou, towards a man who had risked everything, not for power, but for principle. And if you're listening now, if you followed this journey to the very end, then know this. This is no longer just a story about Burkina Faso. It's a chapter in a larger book. One that belongs to every African, every free thinker, every believer in dignity over dominance. Captain Ibrahim Traoré lit the match. But it's up to us to carry the fire. So if this story moved you, don't just watch it. Share it. Speak it. Stand with it, because history isn't something we inherit, it's something we create. Together. If you believe that a small nation can still rise, proud and unshaken, before the giants of this world, if you believe that Africa has the right to write its own destiny, in its own voice, on its own terms, if you've seen the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes and felt it burn in your chest, then this story is also yours. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Not just to support, but to stand with us. This isn't just content. It's a call that a quiet storm is rising. And we are the wave. Because the whispers of resistance have become a roar, and history, whether they like it or not, is changing hands. In a world shaped by power, alliances, and historical imbalance, the story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré teaches us something we are rarely encouraged to believe, that the courage of one leader, guided not by fear or calculation, but by principle, can spark a movement far greater than any one moment. At the heart of this story lies a simple yet revolutionary idea, that Africa no longer needs permission to lead. For decades, the continent has been spoken about, negotiated over, and extracted from, rarely given the platform to act independently without consequence. Burkina Faso, a small, landlocked country, is not often seen as a key player on the global stage. And yet, through one bold decision, it became the epicenter of a political and symbolic earthquake that shook the pillars of modern imperial influence. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's choice to invite K.im J.on.g U.n was not just a diplomatic stunt. It was a statement. One that said Africa will no longer be confined to the expectations of former colonizers or global powers. The move was risky. It was controversial. It was condemned across Western media and political circles. But it was also deliberate, rooted in the legacy of revolutionary leaders who understood that true independence cannot coexist with silent obedience. The lesson here is not that Africa should align with any particular power, East or West. The lesson is that Africa must have the right to choose without being punished. Sovereignty is not a performance for foreign investors or institutions. It is the ability to make decisions, bold, imperfect, and fully your own, without fear of retaliation. That is what Captain Traore embodied. Not just resistance, but self-determination. In the face of threats, sanctions, media attacks, and even attempted violence, Traore did not back down. He understood something that many leaders have forgotten, that legitimacy comes not from external approval, but from standing by your people, even when the cost is high. It is easy to govern when the path is smooth. But true leadership is forged in fire. This story also reveals the hypocrisy that continues to define global politics. While Western governments frequently engage with authoritarian regimes when it suits their interests, they are quick to condemn African nations for doing the same. The outrage over Traore's invitation to K.im J.on.g U.n was not about morality, it was about control. It was about fear. Fear that Africa, if it begins to act on its own terms, might no longer be manageable. Might no longer be dependent. Might, at last, become truly free. But perhaps the most powerful lesson lies not in the politics, but in the people. The citizens of Burkina Faso did not panic. They rallied. They stood beside their president, not because he